The town of Millhaven, tucked deep into the southern countryside, had always carried the kind of silence people elsewhere envied. Nights fell gently there, with the sound of cicadas humming in the trees, and mornings began with church bells ringing from the old red-brick chapel at the center of town. Neighbors greeted each other by name, and secrets rarely survived long in the air. Or at least, that was what everyone thought. Among the town's most respected couples were Robert and Elaine Carter. For more than 20 years, they had stood as a picture of loyalty and decency. Robert was steady, soft-spoken, the type of man who helped neighbors fix their roofs and never asked for anything in return. Elaine was known for her grace and warmth, the kind of woman who baked pies for the church fundraiser and never missed a Sunday service. To those around them, theirs was a marriage without shadows, a love that seemed unshakable. But beneath the surface of Millhaven's peace, something was quietly brewing. Elaine had begun to notice small things about her husband, late nights he could not explain, strange phone calls he would take in the garage, receipts tucked in his wallet for places he claimed he had never been. These were not the kinds of things she dared speak aloud. After all, Robert had always been her rock. Yet, in the private chambers of her mind, doubt had started to creep in like a slow poison. On a warm Tuesday evening, they shared what would be their final dinner together. The table was set simply: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and cornbread. Elaine remembered the way Robert smiled at her across the table, his eyes tired but kind, as though he carried a weight he could never put into words. They spoke about ordinary things: the yard that needed mowing, a neighbor's son joining the army, the upcoming church gathering. Nothing in that moment suggested that by nightfall their lives would fracture forever. The call came the next morning. Robert had been found dead, the victim of what authorities labeled a tragic accident. The details were scarce: something about his car swerving off the road, colliding with a barrier, his body retrieved in a state too brutal for Elaine to imagine. When the sheriff himself knocked on her door, hat in hand, eyes heavy with pity, Elaine's world collapsed. She remembered sinking into the couch, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "No, no, that can't be," she whispered, as though refusing to let the words root themselves in reality. The sheriff tried to comfort her, speaking gently, but the words dissolved into meaningless noise. All Elaine could think of was the way Robert had looked at her the night before, the way his hand had lingered a second longer on hers, as if he had known something she didn't. The news spread quickly through Millhaven. At the local diner, whispers floated from booth to booth. "Robert Carter? Gone?" someone murmured in disbelief. At the church, prayers were spoken, heads bowed, the congregation mourning a man who had been so much a part of their lives. To the outside world, it was a tragedy that seemed straightforward, a beloved husband and neighbor taken too soon by cruel fate. But to Elaine, grief came tangled with something else, a gnawing sense that what she had lost was not only her husband, but also the chance to understand who he truly was. The night pressed heavy against her windows, and as she sat alone in their quiet house, the silence felt unbearable. The town believed Robert Carter's story had ended on a roadside. Elaine could not shake the feeling that his story was only just beginning, and that whatever truth waited ahead would demand more than her heart was prepared to give. The days following Robert's sudden death moved with a haze that Elaine could not escape. She lived as if under water, hearing people's voices muffled, seeing their faces blur in and out of focus. Friends stopped by with casseroles, neighbors offered prayers, the pastor visited with soft words of comfort. Yet none of it pierced the fog that had settled over her. The only thing she could think about was the call she dreaded most, the one that would ask her to identify Robert's body. It came on the third morning. Sheriff Dunlap phoned her just after sunrise. His voice was heavy with a kind of tone that carried both duty and sorrow. "Mrs. Carter, it's time," he said. "The medical examiner needs confirmation. I can go with you, if you'd like." Elaine's throat tightened. For a long moment she could not answer, only clutched the receiver with white knuckles. Finally she whispered, "Yes, please. I can't do it alone." The county morgue sat on the edge of Millhaven, in a squat grey building that looked more like an abandoned warehouse than a place meant for the final passage of human lives. The ride there was silent. Sheriff Dunlap drove, his hat resting on his knee, occasionally glancing at her but never speaking. Elaine sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes staring blankly at the road ahead. When they arrived, the air outside was sharp and sterile, carrying the faint smell of disinfectant even before they stepped inside. A clerk led them down a narrow hallway where fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Each step echoed against the tile floor, a sound that seemed to announce her grief louder than words ever could. Dr. Alan Whitmore, the county medical examiner, greeted them at the end of the hall. He was a man in his early 60s, balding, glasses perched low on his nose, his expression professional but not unkind. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, extending a hand she barely felt in her own. "I'm very sorry for your loss. This will only take a moment." Elaine nodded, her lips pressed together, her body trembling as though her very bones resisted the moment that awaited her. The doors swung open, and the room beyond was colder than she imagined. The air carried that unmistakable chill of preservation, mixed with a faint metallic tang of chemicals. Stainless steel tables gleamed under harsh lights. At the far end, a sheet-covered form lay still, the outline of a man beneath the fabric. Her legs weakened instantly. Sheriff Dunlap steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Take your time," he whispered. Dr. Whitmore moved to the table, his hands respectful, steady. "When you're ready, Mrs. Carter, I'll uncover the face." Elaine closed her eyes for a long moment, whispering a prayer under her breath. Then she opened them again and gave the faintest nod. The sheet was pulled back. The world seemed to collapse into silence. There he was, or what was left of him. Robert's face was bruised, marked by the violence of the crash, his features distorted in a way that both was and wasn't the man she had loved for 2 decades. His lips were pale, his skin waxen, yet still, in the arch of his brow, in the curve of his jaw, she saw him. Her knees buckled. A sob tore from her chest, raw and desperate. "Robert! Oh, Robert!" Her hands covered her mouth, her body shaking. She reached out instinctively, fingers brushing the cold edge of the sheet, before jerking back as if burned. Dr. Whitmore's voice was careful. "Mrs. Carter, are you certain you can confirm the identity? I need your word before the paperwork can proceed." Through her tears, she nodded. "Yes, that's my husband." Her voice cracked, breaking on the word husband. "That's Robert Carter." But even as she spoke the words, something stirred uneasily within her. For in that awful, frozen face, she had noticed something else. A mark along his neck, faint but unmistakable, that didn't look like any injury caused by a car crash. It was deep, linear, almost as if from a hand or a rope. She said nothing, not then. The thought clamped down inside her chest like a secret. Sheriff Dunlap placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've been brave, Elaine. We can leave now." She nodded, though her eyes stayed on Robert's body a moment longer. There was so much she wanted to say, so many questions she longed to ask him. Why the late nights? Why the hidden receipts? Why the look in his eyes at dinner, as though he had been carrying a secret too heavy to share? But the dead do not answer. Dr. Whitmore pulled the sheet back over Robert's face. The sound of the fabric sliding across the steel table was final, like a curtain falling at the end of a play. Elaine turned away, her chest hollow, her body heavy, her soul carrying more than grief alone. As they walked back down the corridor, Sheriff Dunlap murmured, "He was a good man, Elaine. The whole town's hurting with you." She managed a weak nod, but inside her heart another voice spoke louder. "Something's wrong. Something about this isn't what they think." By the time she stepped back out into the sunlight, her grief was tangled with a darker thread: suspicion. The town saw a widow in mourning. But inside, Elaine Carter was a woman who had just witnessed more than a body. She had seen the first shadow of a truth that might be far more dangerous than her sorrow. The days after Elaine's visit to the morgue passed like a fever dream. The house she and Robert had shared for 2 decades seemed impossibly large without his presence. His chair at the kitchen table sat empty, the faint smell of his aftershave still clinging to the bathroom, the jacket he'd worn just days before hanging limply by the door. Every corner carried an echo, and with every passing hour, those echoes cut deeper into her chest. Neighbors filled the silence as best they could. They arrived with pies, casseroles, bouquets of flowers from their gardens. They sat with Elaine on the porch, speaking softly about Robert, about his generosity, about his laugh, about the way he had always been the first to lend a hand. She smiled politely, but behind her eyes, her mind was elsewhere, because Elaine could not forget what she had seen at the morgue. That mark on Robert's neck, thin, precise, not ragged like a wound from twisted metal, haunted her. It replayed in her mind whenever she closed her eyes, taunting her with its refusal to fit the story she'd been told. At night she barely slept. She sat by the bedroom window, staring out into the yard where the porch light cast a weak glow over the grass. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps outside, the crunch of gravel, but when she looked, nothing was there. In those hours, her grief blended with dread, until she could no longer tell one from the other. On the second evening, her closest friend, Martha, came by with a pot of soup. Martha was blunt by nature, the kind of woman who could slice through pity with a single sentence. She set the soup down firmly on the counter and looked Elaine in the eye. "You're not sleeping," Martha said. "I can't," Elaine admitted, her voice weary. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him, but not the Robert the first knew, the one under that sheet." Martha reached for her hand. "That's grief, honey. It'll play tricks on you. You just have to let time do its work." Elaine hesitated, then lowered her voice. "It's more than grief. There was something on his neck, a mark that shouldn't have been there." Martha frowned. "Are you saying—" "I don't know what I'm saying," Elaine whispered, "but I can't shake the feeling his death wasn't an accident." Martha squeezed her hand tighter. "Careful with thoughts like that. People don't take kindly to stirring up shadows where there should be peace. Robert's gone. You need to focus on yourself now." But Elaine knew her friend's warning came from fear, not certainty. She could see it in Martha's eyes. The seed of doubt had been planted there too. On the third day, Elaine sat at her desk, rifling through Robert's belongings. She opened his wallet, flipping past the familiar family photo, and found a folded receipt tucked deep inside, a bill from a motel on the outskirts of town. The date was from just a week before his death. Her hands trembled as she read it. Robert had told her he'd been working late that night, finishing paperwork at the office. Her stomach churned. She opened his phone, which the sheriff had returned to her after the investigation logged it. Most messages were ordinary, reminders, notes, texts from co-workers. But one number appeared again and again, late at night, always brief. "Call me. We need to talk. Don't leave me hanging." The contact name was saved only as C. Elaine closed the phone, her pulse racing. The puzzle pieces did not fit, but she could feel the outline of something larger, darker, forming just beyond her reach. That evening, when another neighbor stopped by with condolences, Elaine barely heard their words. She was already locked in her own thoughts, a whisper repeating itself over and over. If Robert lied about this, what else was he hiding? Alone in her bedroom, she pressed her hands together in prayer. "God, give me strength," she murmured. "Show me what I need to see." But deep down, she already knew she had seen too much. The grief was real, yes, but grief was no longer the only thing living in her chest. Suspicion had moved in beside it, and with every hour that passed, suspicion grew sharper, more insistent. And in the quiet of that third night, as the clock struck midnight, Elaine admitted something she had been too afraid to say aloud. Robert's death was not what they told me it was. And if I'm right, then I'm in danger too. On the morning of the fourth day, the sun rose over Millhaven like any other, soft golden light spilling over the rooftops, the church bell tolling faintly in the distance. But in the Carter home, the stillness had grown heavier, more suffocating. Elaine moved through her house like a shadow. She poured coffee she didn't drink, straightened cushions no one had disturbed, and lingered by the window as though waiting for something, or someone, to appear. The unease that had taken root in her since the morgue was now a constant hum in her chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind against the shutters made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was grief, nerves fraying under the strain. But deep down she felt watched. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in streaks of purple and orange, Martha called to check on her. "Do you want me to stay the night?" her friend asked. Elaine forced a laugh, though it sounded thin even to her. "No, I'll be fine. You've done enough already. Besides, I have some things I need to look through." "Promise me you'll lock the doors," Martha said firmly. "I will," Elaine replied, though her hand shook as she set the receiver down. The house grew quiet again. Elaine gathered Robert's papers from the desk, sorting through bills, notes, and that motel receipt that refused to leave her mind. She pulled out a pen and began writing a letter, her hand moving quickly, as though urgency pressed her forward. She addressed it to Martha, explaining what she had discovered, her suspicions about Robert's death, and her fear that she might be next. The words came jagged, uneven, her pen blotting the page in places where her hand trembled. She wrote, "If anything happens to me, know this was not by my choice. Look at Robert's phone records. Follow the money. Someone wanted him gone, and now they may want me gone too." Her breath quickened as she folded the letter and slipped it into the top drawer of her desk. She had barely closed it when a sudden noise echoed from the back of the house, a sharp thud, like a door being forced. Elaine froze. "Hello." Her voice wavered in the silence. No answer. Her heart pounded as she rose, moving carefully toward the sound. The hallway was dark, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. She reached for the phone on the side table, but the line was dead. The dial tone that always hummed softly was gone, leaving only silence. Panic surged through her. She backed away, but before she could move far, she caught sight of the front door. The lock hung twisted, as though forced from outside. The living room seemed to shrink around her. She clutched the phone in her hand like a weapon, though she knew it was useless. Then came footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floorboards. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The footsteps quickened. She stumbled back, bumping into the desk, the drawer sliding open just enough to reveal the letter inside. Her trembling fingers reached toward it, but before she could grab it, a hand, large, rough, seized her from behind. Her scream tore through the house, sharp and desperate, before it was muffled by force. The struggle was violent, brief, and merciless. The lamp on the side table crashed to the floor, glass shattering across the rug. A framed photo of her and Robert toppled, face down, as if unwilling to watch. When the neighbors saw the flashing lights later that night, they rushed outside in their robes and slippers, whispering in confusion. Sheriff Dunlap's cruiser sat at the curb, his face grim as deputies moved in and out of the Carter home. Inside, Elaine's body lay crumpled near the desk, the unfinished letter still clutched in her hand. The room bore signs of struggle, furniture overturned, papers scattered, glass littering the floor. But the front door, strangely, had been locked from the outside when officers arrived. At first glance, some whispered it was suicide, grief driving her to the brink. But the scene told another story. The bruises on her arms, the angle of her fall, the way her hand still clung to that desperate note. Sheriff Dunlap shook his head, his jaw tight. "This wasn't no suicide," he muttered to his deputy. "Someone wanted her silenced." By dawn, the town buzzed with disbelief. First Robert, now Elaine, both gone in less than a week. To many, it felt like a curse had fallen over the Carters. To others, it was something darker, a cover-up, an unfinished story that someone was desperate to bury. And somewhere, in the chaos of grief and speculation, the truth Elaine had feared most hung heavy in the air, unspoken but waiting to be uncovered. The news of Elaine Carter's death travelled through Millhaven like wildfire. By sunrise, the town's coffee shop hummed with whispers. "First Robert, now Elaine," someone muttered over a cup of steaming black coffee. "What are the odds?" Another shook her head, voice trembling. That family was cursed. But inside the Carter home, where the air still carried the metallic tang of broken glass and fear, investigators found something that shifted the case from a story of grief to one of conspiracy. Deputy Mark Stevens was the first to notice the desk drawer. Amid the overturned furniture and scattered papers, it looked ordinary enough, half open as though disturbed during the struggle. But inside, tucked between envelopes and stationery, lay a folded piece of paper smudged with ink and spotted faintly with Elaine's dried tears. "Sheriff," Stevens called, his voice low but urgent. Sheriff Dunlap took the paper, unfolding it carefully with gloved hands. The words inside were hurried, jagged, yet unmistakably deliberate. "If anything happens to me, this is not by my hand. Robert's death was no accident. He was being followed, pressured, tied to money he could not explain. Look into the phone records. Look at the calls from C. I believe whoever took him is coming for me too." At the bottom, her shaky signature, Elaine Carter. The sheriff's jaw clenched. He read the words twice, 3 times, then looked at his deputy. "This isn't grief talking," he muttered. "She knew something." Word of the letter leaked quickly. Within hours, townsfolk who had been murmuring about heartbreak began whispering about murder. The Carters, once seen as a couple to admire, now became the center of speculation and rumor. Some pitied them as victims of forces beyond their control. Others suggested Robert's life had been less pure than he appeared. At the morgue, Dr. Whitmore confirmed Sheriff Dunlap's suspicion. He reviewed Robert's injuries again and admitted, reluctantly, that something had troubled him from the start. "The bruising along the neck," he explained, pointing to his notes. "I recorded it as consistent with trauma from the accident, but, truthfully, it could also suggest strangulation." Sheriff Dunlap pressed his palm against the table. "Why didn't you say that before?" Whitmore lowered his eyes. "Because people don't want uncertainty in death. They want answers. And frankly, I wasn't sure until I saw this second tragedy. Now I can't ignore it." The sheriff exhaled heavily. 2 deaths in 4 days. A widow who claimed her husband was killed and left her suspicions in writing. A community teetering between mourning and fear. This was no longer a matter of paperwork. It was a case of murder. The next step was Robert's phone. Elaine had mentioned calls from C. With a warrant in hand, deputies combed through the records. The same number appeared again and again, always at odd hours. 11:47 p.m., 1:15 a.m., 2:32 a.m. Dozens of calls in the weeks before Robert's death. The number belonged to a woman named Clara Jennings, a receptionist at a law office in a neighboring town. She was younger than Elaine by nearly 20 years, known for her sharp looks and a reputation that followed her like perfume. Clara had crossed paths with Robert at community fundraisers and, according to whispers, at more private meetings as well. When deputies approached her, Clara didn't flinch. She stood on the porch of her modest home, arms crossed, her dark hair pulled tight, eyes flashing with both irritation and something sharper, defiance. "Robert Carter was a friend," she said coolly. "That's all. He called me for advice. Financial matters. Nothing more. Advice at 2 in the morning?" Deputy Stevens pressed. Her lip curled into a smirk. "Some people don't like to keep normal hours. Doesn't make me a murderer." Still, her connection to Robert, and by extension, Elaine's suspicions, was undeniable. Back at the station, Sheriff Dunlap laid the letter on his desk and studied it under the lamp's glow. He thought of Elaine's trembling voice at the morgue, the way she had seemed unsettled beyond grief. She had seen something in her husband's death, something no one else had been willing to confront. And now she had paid for it. The sheriff addressed his team. "This isn't 2 tragedies. This is one chain. Robert knew something, and it got him killed. Elaine figured it out, and it got her killed. Whoever's behind this thinks they buried their secrets with the Carters. We're not going to let that happen." The investigation widened. Financial records showed Robert had made several large withdrawals in the months before his death, amounts far greater than his modest salary could explain. Cash gone, no trace of where it landed. His co-workers described him as distracted, nervous, constantly checking his phone. Martha, when questioned, broke down in tears. "Elaine told me she didn't believe the accident. She said Robert had been keeping things from her. But I told her not to stir up shadows. I should have listened. Maybe she'd still be alive." Each new detail painted a darker picture. Robert had been ensnared in something dangerous, something that didn't vanish when he died. Elaine had seen the threads, pulled at them, and in doing so had signed her own death warrant. As night fell over Millhaven, the sheriff returned to the Carter home. The house stood silent, a shell of what it once was, the front door repaired but the scars of violence still visible. He walked through the rooms, pausing at the desk where Elaine had written her final words. He could almost hear her voice, trembling but resolute. "If anything happens to me, this is not by my hand." He closed the drawer gently. For Sheriff Dunlap, the case was no longer about answers for the community. It was about justice for Elaine. And as he stepped back out into the cool night air, he knew one thing with certainty. The truth was buried deep, but it was there. And if he didn't uncover it, Millhaven would never sleep soundly again. For Sheriff Dunlap, the discovery of Elaine's letter turned the Carters' tragedy into a storm that refused to settle. Each new detail seemed to scrape away the small-town image Robert had left behind. The man Millhaven thought they knew, the reliable neighbor, the devoted husband, was now revealed to be entangled in something darker, something that reached beyond the town's borders. The investigation began with Clara Jennings. On paper, she was nothing more than a receptionist at a mid-sized law office in Ashford, the next county over. But the phone records painted another picture. Robert had called her dozens of times in the weeks leading up to his death, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes back-to-back, as though he was desperate for her attention. Sheriff Dunlap arranged a formal interview at the station. Clara arrived dressed sharply, her blouse pressed, her lipstick a bold red that looked almost like defiance. She carried herself as though she had already rehearsed every answer. "Miss Jennings," Dunlap began, folding Elaine's letter on the table between them, You know why you're here." Her eyes flicked to the paper, then back to him. Because a grieving woman scribbled paranoid thoughts before taking her own life? The sheriff leaned forward. "Careful. That grieving woman was murdered, and her letter puts you right in the middle of this mess." Clara's jaw tightened. For the first time, the coolness in her expression cracked. "I didn't kill anyone. Robert was complicated. He was in over his head, and yes, I knew about it. But don't you dare pin his death, or hers, on me." "Then help me understand," Dunlap pressed. "What was he in over his head with?" She hesitated, her painted nails drumming against the table. Finally, she sighed. "Money." He was laundering money for a man named Victor Hale. Real estate, cash businesses, you name it. Robert didn't go looking for trouble, Sheriff. Trouble found him. He made one mistake, and Hale never let him go. Dunlap exchanged a glance with Deputy Stevens, who had been listening quietly in the corner. "Why would Robert risk that?" Clara's voice dropped. "Because he was desperate. He told me Elaine thought they were struggling financially. He wanted to give her a better life, a nicer house, maybe even retire early. At first it was small transactions, but soon the numbers grew. When Robert wanted out, Hale threatened him. "And you?" Dunlap asked, narrowing his eyes. "What was your part in all this?" Her lips curved into a bitter smile. "I was the go-between. Robert trusted me to deliver messages, to smooth things over. Maybe he trusted me too much." She paused, leaning back in her chair. "But Sheriff, I'm not the one you're looking for. If Robert was killed, if Elaine was silenced, it's Hale. He doesn't leave loose ends." The name Victor Hale sent a ripple of recognition through Dunlap. He had heard it before. Whispers about a businessman with a clean suit and dirty hands, a man who threw money around at fundraisers but was rumored to have half the county under his thumb. Still, rumor wasn't evidence, and the sheriff knew going after Hale would be like stepping into quicksand. After Clara left, Deputy Stevens shook his head. "You believe her?" "I believe part of it," Dunlap muttered. "The rest we'll have to dig out." The digging began with Robert's financials. Bank records showed large cash withdrawals, often followed by deposits into shell accounts linked to businesses in Ashford, laundromats, car washes, rental properties. It was textbook laundering. Robert had been a pawn, but the paper trail suggested he hadn't been entirely unwilling. Still, the most damning detail was the timeline. Days before his accident, Robert had withdrawn $20,000 in cash. None of it was ever found. He was holding on to it, Stevens speculated as they reviewed the records. Maybe planning to turn it over, maybe planning to run. Dunlap rubbed his chin. Or maybe he told Elaine. Maybe that's why she looked so shaken at the morgue. Maybe she knew the real reason he died. Dr. Whitmore, when pressed further, admitted something chilling. The mark on Robert's neck. It troubled me. It looked like pressure applied before the crash, not after. If I had to put my reputation on it, Sheriff, I'd say he was dead before the car ever hit the barrier. The words hung in the air like smoke. If Robert had been murdered and his accident staged, then Elaine's suspicions had been right all along, and her death, 3 days later, was no coincidence. The sheriff decided to confront Clara again, this time outside the formality of the station. He found her at a cafe in Ashford, sitting alone with a cup of coffee, her eyes darting nervously toward the door every few seconds. "You're scared," Dunlap said, sliding into the booth across from her. Clara stiffened. "You would be too, if you knew what Hale does to people who cross him." Then why talk to me at all? Because I'm tired of running. Her voice cracked slightly. Robert was supposed to pay him off, but he stalled. I think he was planning something. Maybe even planned to turn Hale in. But before he could, Hale got to him. And now Elaine. Clara stopped, her hands trembling. If they killed her, it's because she knew too much. Just like Robert. The sheriff studied her closely. What about you? How long until Hale decides you know too much? Her eyes glistened, and for the first time, Clara Jennings looked less like a calculating mistress and more like a woman cornered by her own choices. Maybe that's why I'm talking. Maybe this is my only chance to get out alive. Back in Millhaven, the townsfolk's grief turned into suspicion. At the church steps, people gathered in hushed clusters. I heard Robert was mixed up with bad people, one man whispered. Elaine tried to expose it, another added, and look what happened to her. The Carters, once the pride of Millhaven, had become its ghost story. Their home stood empty, but their presence lingered, heavy in every whispered conversation, in every sidelong glance. Sheriff Dunlap knew the investigation was entering dangerous territory. Victor Hale wasn't just a name. He was a force, and taking him on could mean more bodies before the truth came out. Still, the sheriff felt a responsibility that weighed heavier than fear. Elaine had trusted him. Her last words written on paper were a plea for someone to follow the trail she had seen so clearly. As he stood once again in the Carter home, looking at the desk where the letter had been found, Dunlap made a silent vow. "I'll see this through," he whispered. "For Robert. For Elaine. For the truth." And though the house was empty, he almost felt as though Elaine herself heard him, her presence lingering in the shadows, urging him forward. Because somewhere out there, in the shadows of money and power, was the man who had destroyed the Carters. And until justice was found, Millhaven would remain haunted. By the time the coroner's full report on Elaine Carter landed on Sheriff Dunlap's desk, he already knew what it would say. Still, reading the words in black and white tightened something in his chest. Cause of death. Asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. Scene staging indicates possible attempt to disguise homicide as self-inflicted or accidental trauma. Elaine had not taken her own life. She had been silenced. Dunlap sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For decades he'd seen violence in all its forms, but this carried a cruelty that burrowed under his skin. Robert had died with secrets on his lips. Elaine had died for trying to uncover them. And now the town was left with 2 funerals and more questions than answers. Deputy Stevens entered quietly, a file tucked under his arm. "Sheriff, we canvassed the neighbors again. A few said they heard shouting the night Elaine died. A man's voice. Not Robert's, someone unfamiliar." Dunlap raised an eyebrow. "Did anyone see him?" One neighbor mentioned a dark sedan parked near the house. No plates, or at least none they could make out. It pulled away fast, right around the time the screaming stopped. The sheriff nodded grimly. Professional. Someone who knew how to get in and out without being recognized. The file Stevens handed him only added weight to the suspicion. Fingerprints had been found on the back door's broken lock, prints that didn't match Elaine, Robert, or anyone in the household. But they were too smudged for a clean identification. A ghost had left them, and ghosts don't leave trails easily. At Elaine's funeral, the church overflowed. Women fanned themselves against the August heat. Men stood in the back with hats in hand, the air heavy with both grief and unease. Pastor Miller's voice trembled as he spoke of Elaine's kindness, her devotion, her unwavering faith. But behind every bowed head, there lingered a question no sermon could ease. Why her? After the service, Martha approached the sheriff, Her eyes rimmed red. "She told me, you know. She said Robert's death wasn't what it seemed. I should have believed her. Maybe I could have saved her." Dunlap shook his head gently. "Don't carry that weight, Martha. The people who did this, they wanted her gone. You couldn't have stopped it." Her lips trembled. "Then you have to stop them, Sheriff. For her." The promise was already etched into his bones. Back at the station, Dunlap spread out the evidence. Robert's suspicious finances, Clara's testimony, the coroner's findings, and Elaine's desperate letter. Every line pointed toward the same shadow, the empire of Victor Hale. But proving it was another matter. Hale's men were careful. They spoke little, left less. Still, whispers began to surface. A local mechanic recalled seeing Robert arguing with a man in a dark suit weeks before his death. A waitress in Ashford remembered Robert sitting in a corner booth with Clara and another man she couldn't identify, broad-shouldered, scar down his cheek. "They looked like they were planning something," she said, "or fighting about something. He didn't look like a man at peace." Deputy Stevens slammed a fist against the desk. "It's right there, Sheriff. Hale's fingerprints without the prints. He sends his men to clean up, makes it look like tragedy or chance, and the town swallows it whole." Dunlap's eyes narrowed. "Maybe the town does. But I don't." The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Late one night, as Dunlap walked to his car after locking up the station, he noticed a folded note tucked beneath his windshield wiper. It read in block letters, "Stop asking questions, or you'll end up like them." The sheriff crumpled the note in his fist, his jaw tightening. Fear wasn't foreign to him, but fury burned hotter. Elaine had died holding her truth in her hands. He refused to let her sacrifice dissolve into silence. Meanwhile, Clara Jennings became more nervous by the day. She called the sheriff's office twice in 1 week, her voice shaking. "They're watching me," she whispered. "I know they are. I see cars outside my apartment at night. If I disappear, don't you dare believe I left town." Dunlap reassured her, but he also knew her fear was valid. If Elaine had been silenced for piecing things together, Clara, who had played middleman in the laundering, was just as vulnerable. In Millhaven, ordinary folks began to divide into 2 camps. Some clung to the belief that Elaine had simply broken under grief, unwilling to entertain the darker truth. "It's easier that way," one woman said at the diner, thinking she just couldn't live without him. Others whispered that the Carters had uncovered something foul, and they had been buried for it. "You don't cross men like Hale and live to tell the tale," an older farmer muttered over his coffee. The controversy grew louder, until it wasn't just a private tragedy. It was a question tearing the community apart. For Sheriff Dunlap, there was no question left. Elaine's death was murder, and if he didn't act, she would become just another ghost in a file cabinet, her warning letter forgotten. One evening, he sat in the Carter home once more, alone with the silence. He opened the drawer where Elaine had left her letter and read it again under the soft glow of a desk lamp. The words leapt off the page. "Look at the calls from C. Follow the money. Someone wanted him gone, and now they may want me gone too." "She was right," he whispered to the empty room. "She was right about all of it." Outside, the night pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine roared and faded. The sheriff didn't flinch. He knew the storm was coming closer, but he also knew this. Elaine Carter's voice might have been silenced, but her truth still lived, and as long as he carried it, the people who killed her hadn't won. The more Sheriff Dunlap pressed into Robert and Elaine Carter's deaths, the more the walls of Millhaven seemed to whisper with warning. People lowered their voices when he walked into the diner, some offering quiet nods of support, others looking away, afraid that even being seen near him would draw the wrong kind of attention. Still, the sheriff pressed forward. He knew time was running out, not just for justice, but for his own safety. Deputy Stevens brought in a lead one afternoon, dropping a photo on the sheriff's desk. It was grainy, taken by a security camera outside the Ashford Motel, the same one tied to Robert's last receipts. The image showed Robert standing by his truck, talking to a man in a dark suit. Broad shoulders, scar down the cheek. The same description the waitress had given. Name's Cole Vance, Stevens explained. Ex-enforcer for Victor Hale. Did time in Texas for assault. Walked out early thanks to Hale's lawyers. Been Hale's shadow ever since. Dunlap studied the photo. If Robert met with Vance, it wasn't to talk about Sunday service. That's our connection. Get him in here. Bringing Cole Vance into custody wasn't easy. Deputies tailed him for days before catching him at a gas station outside Ashford. He smirked when they cuffed him, like he'd been through this routine before. At the station, seated under the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes glittering with mock amusement. "You boys think you've got something," he drawled. "But you don't." Sheriff Dunlap placed a file on the table, opening it to reveal the motel receipt, phone logs, and Elaine's letter. "You met with Robert Carter days before his death. Witnesses place you near the scene. And Elaine, she's dead too, after writing this." He tapped the letter. "You want to tell me why that is?" Vance chuckled low. "Carter was a coward. Thought he could back out of a deal. That's what happens when you dance with men like Hale. You don't just walk away." "So you admit it?" Dunlap pressed, but Vance's smile returned, sharper this time. "I admit nothing. And even if I did, what good would it do you? You think you can take Hale down? Sheriff, men bigger than you have tried. They don't last long." The words hung in the room like smoke. Stevens leaned forward, his voice tight. "Elaine Carter was murdered in her own home. You expect us to believe you had nothing to do with that?" Vance's expression hardened. For the first time, a flicker of something dangerous crossed his face. "Lady stuck her nose where it didn't belong. That's all I'll say. It was enough. Not a confession, but close. A slip that revealed more than he intended." Dunlap knew it, and so did Vance, who leaned back with a smug grin as though daring them to act. But Hale's reach was long. Within hours, pressure began to mount. A call came from the county prosecutor's office. Release Vance for insufficient evidence. A lawyer arrived with paperwork already in hand. By evening, Vance walked free, smirking as he passed the deputies. "Next time, Sheriff," he said coolly, "try harder." That night, Dunlap sat in his office, the lamp casting shadows across the cluttered desk. Stevens paced the floor, seething. They just let him go. He as much as admitted it in there. "They let him go because Hale's got the system in his pocket," Dunlap muttered. "But we've got something more powerful than Hale's money. Elaine's letter, Robert's records, and the truth people are starting to whisper." Stevens stopped pacing. "Whispers don't put men like Hale behind bars." "No," Dunlap agreed, his eyes narrowing. "But evidence does. And we're going to find it." Meanwhile, Clara Jennings was unraveling. She called again, her voice panicked. "They came to my apartment. I heard someone jiggling the lock. I didn't answer, but I know they'll be back." Dunlap sent a deputy to keep watch, but he knew protection could only go so far. Hale's men were like smoke, slipping through cracks, leaving only fear in their wake. Clara was a liability, and if she didn't testify soon, she might not live to. The sheriff met her in a quiet diner off the highway, the kind of place where the jukebox drowned out conversation. Clara's hands shook as she stirred her coffee. "I can't do this any more," she whispered. "Hale knows I've talked to you. He'll come for me next." "Then help me stop him," Dunlap said firmly. "Testify. Put his name on the record. You're the missing piece, Clara. Without you, all we've got are suspicions and a dead couple." Tears filled her eyes. "You don't understand. He doesn't just kill people, Sheriff. He erases them. He makes it so they never existed. That's what he was going to do to Robert. That's what he did to Elaine." Dunlap leaned in. "And if we don't stand up to him, that's what he'll keep doing. How many more? How long before it's you?" Clara's silence stretched long. Finally, with a trembling breath, she nodded. "I'll testify. But you better keep me alive until then." The sheriff drove back to Millhaven with the weight of her words heavy on his shoulders. For the first time, there was a real chance at piercing Hale's armor. But there was also a clock ticking, louder, faster. Hale would know she had turned, and Hale didn't leave loose ends. That night, as Dunlap stood outside the Carter home one last time, the porch light casting long shadows across the yard, he felt the gravity of what lay ahead. Robert's secrets had cost him his life. Elaine's courage had cost her hers. Now Clara Jennings was the last thread in a story soaked with betrayal and blood. And Sheriff Dunlap knew, if he failed to protect her, Millhaven would have 3 funerals instead of 2. The courtroom in Ashford was packed on the day Clara Jennings finally took the stand. Reporters filled the benches, townsfolk leaned forward with wide eyes, and at the front sat Victor Hale, polished as ever in a tailored suit, his expression calm, almost bored. He looked less like a man facing exposure, and more like a banker waiting for a loan to be approved. Sheriff Dunlap sat in the back, arms folded, eyes locked on Clara as she rose to testify. He knew the risk she was taking. He also knew she had run out of choices. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. She recounted the late-night calls, the meetings at the motel, the threats whispered in the dark. She told them about the money Robert had been laundering, about how he wanted to escape, about how he had become desperate. And she told them about Elaine, how Elaine had stumbled onto the truth, and how Hale's men had made sure she never spoke it aloud. Gasps rippled through the room. Hale sat motionless, his lips curling ever so slightly into what looked like a smirk. His attorney objected at every turn, trying to dismantle Clara's words, painting her as a bitter woman inventing stories to save herself. But the damage was done. Hale's name was now tied to Robert and Elaine Carter's deaths in open court. When Clara stepped down, her hands shaking, Dunlap gave her the smallest nod. She had done it. She had given the Carters a voice. But the sheriff also knew this was far from victory. Days later, the judge announced there was not enough direct evidence to indict Hale for murder. The laundering charges stuck, but barely. Hale paid his bail without flinching, walked out of the courthouse with cameras flashing, and slipped back into the world as though nothing had changed. In Millhaven, the news hit like a hammer. Some cursed the justice system. Others shook their heads, resigned. "You can't touch men like him," one man muttered at the diner. "They're untouchable." But Sheriff Dunlap refused to accept that. He sat late into the night at his desk, Elaine's letter spread out before him, her handwriting jagged and desperate. "If anything happens to me, this is not by my hand." Those words had become his compass. He knew Hale hadn't been absolved. He had simply escaped, for now. Clara went into protective custody, her fear growing sharper by the day. "He'll come for me," she whispered to the sheriff during one late-night phone call. "I can feel it." Dunlap promised to keep her safe, but he also knew protection could only last so long. Hale had resources that stretched further than his small-town department ever could. The Carter's house stood empty, its windows dark, the porch light burned out. Children in the neighborhood whispered that it was haunted, daring each other to run up the steps at night. For the sheriff, the haunting was real. Each time he drove past, he saw Robert's truck rusting in the drive, Elaine's flowers withering in the garden, and he felt the weight of lives stolen too soon. At the cemetery, 2 graves lay side by side, Robert's marked with a polished stone, Elaine's with a simpler one. Fresh flowers often appeared there, though no one claimed them. Some said it was Martha. Others swore it was Dunlap himself, visiting in the quiet hours before dawn. One evening, after another long day chasing leads that slipped like smoke, Dunlap stood before their graves, hat in hand. "I couldn't give you justice," he whispered, voice rough. "Not yet. But I won't stop. Not while I still have breath in me." The wind stirred the trees, and for a moment he thought he heard Elaine's voice, soft, steady, urging him not to let go. In Millhaven, life went on. The church bells still rang, the diner still served its morning coffee, neighbors still mowed their lawns. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The Carters' deaths had left a scar that would not heal, a reminder that darkness can creep even into the quietest of towns. And for Sheriff Dunlap, the case was never truly closed. It lingered in his files, in his dreams, in the silent rooms of the Carter home. He knew Victor Hale had blood on his hands. He knew Cole Vance had left his shadow in Millhaven, and he knew, sooner or later, they would slip. Until then, Robert and Elaine remained more than names on stones. They were ghosts that refused to rest, their story unfinished, their truth demanding to be heard. And in Millhaven, on nights when the wind howled through the trees and the church bell rang in the dark, folks swore you could still hear Elaine's voice in the air, whispering the words she left behind. "This is not by my hand."